Aristotle's treatises, both those concerning the study of nature and those dealing with human sciences, begin in accordance with his realistic philosophy from a point that seeks to delimit the subject area. This either through an exposition of direct investigation or a compilation of what has been said by his predecessors. Following this is an argumentative or dialectical line, whichever is considered to be more appropriate to the starting point and to the nature of the issue under discussion. Our goal in this paper is to study how Aristotle includes these historical expositions in his treatises of metaphysics, cosmology, and as well as human and natural sciences, by means of popular scientific methods, such as dialectical argumentation, principle of generalization, or enthymeme, truncated syllogisms based on probability without explicit premises. What we propose here is to describe and evaluate this whole process. First, we will consider the starting point, defining the notions of direct investigation, historia, and indirect investigation, endoxa. We will then turn to those passages in which Aristotle indicates how indirect investigation should be used in scholarly argumentation. And closely linked to this, we will also address the issue of the continuity and discontinuity of thought and society. And finally, we will consider how direct investigation receives different treatment in different disciplines, be it of an academic, informative, or generalizing character. The meaning of the term historia. In the case of direct investigation, the prior word which is presented as the starting point for the treatises is referred to as historia. This term has Indo-European origins. The root with white to see is the one that we find in video, in Greek, id, aorist of the verb to see, and we find the same root in oida, to know, derived from the past perfect of the verb to see. Thus, it conveys the sense of to know as direct knowledge or having seen, and the same root can be found in the term histor, he who has seen, the direct witness. And hence, the word also means observation, inquiry, investigation, and in one sense, it could also imply verification, in that it establishes a link between knowledge and direct testimony. But the meaning of observation, we find, as we find in the text number 1, is an adequate method for certain disciplines. We find the word in history of animals in the text number 2 and on the soul in the text number 3. In other texts, the term refers to the next process, that is of verification and description, historical survey, which follows observation, as in text number 4. And there is a similar process to what in the first analytics is called empeiria, experience, described, text number 5, as the initial stage in which the basic principles pertaining to each subject are given. And it is the necessary prior stage for achieving artistic or scholarly knowledge. And finally, in the treatises on human sciences, it acquires the meaning of historical work, as in rhetoric in the text number 6 and poetics in numbers 7 and 8. The linking point of these three meanings bring us closer to the first phase of the dialectical treatment that Aristotle uses on his data. In the Aristotelian doctrine of different and diverse stages of knowledge, as explained in Metaphysics A and in Posterior Analytics 2, the first stage of knowledge is sense perception, aesthesis. From this, an image is created, fantasia, and when a copy of this image is in itself made and stored in the mind, it is a memory, mneme. The evocation of memory of a specific thing is experience, empeiria, described as the universal now stabilized in its entirety within the soul, that which remains whole and unique to itself amid all the transitory feelings and memories of particular beings. Experience is fixed and whole, in that it unifies and stabilizes sensorial and mnemonic evocation over time. And it is this reference to the passing of time, along with the non-generalized objective fixing of ideas, that these three meanings of the term historia have in common, since they describe in its context a type of knowledge of specific past facts, and as a consequence are neither universal nor necessary, but rather a type of preliminary knowledge of the scientific or philosophical, as well as of the knowledge on which these are themselves based. The knowledge of experts, the endoxa. Indirect experience is constituted by the opinions of experts, the so-called endoxa. And, as it will be described below, is used on the one hand as a starting point and on the other as a basic for any type of investigation, thus acquiring the same value as the knowledge of experience, as we have already described, and serving as a source of argumentation analogous to that based on the factual and verified data provided by direct investigation, also mentioned above. In Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explains the reasons for this approach in the text number 9. The unproved assertions and opinions of experienced and older people or prudent men are as much deserving of attention as those which are supported by proof, for experience has given them an eye for things, and so they see correctly. The inclusion of other opinions as a starting point is one of Aristotle's most enduring contributions to the history of thought. It implies that a certain linear historical process exists, a development in thought over time, and consequently a new type of philosophical conscience, which is both more responsible and more complex. We now turn to the question of how argumentation can be conducted from a starting point of indirect investigation, from knowledge transmitted and supported by premises that do not assert something true or certain, but which are based on gathering the opinions of experts and reputable thinkers of the past. This is what is known as dialectic argumentation, differing from syllogistic argumentation in that the latter is based on truth, whereas the former is based on verisimilitude. Its nature would be similar to that of rhetorical enthymeme, whose premises generally come from the description of habits and the more or less shared opinions of the listeners that the speaker knows and which are used in support of a convincing argumentation. Hence, this constitutes the field of the plausible, of the probable, of that which happens most of the time, hos epitopoli, and Aristotle always defined this by comparison with logical argumentation, as explained in the text number 10. It is dialectical if the reasoning is from opinions that are generally accepted. Things are true and primary when they are believed on the strength of nothing other than themselves. On the other hand, opinions that are generally accepted are those which are accepted by everyone, by the majority, by philosophers, or by the most notable and illustrious of these. Alexander of Aphrodisias, in his commentary on the topics, made the meaning of this notion even more precise. Text 11. Plausibility differs from the truth, not in being false. Some commendable opinions are in fact true, but for the criteria on which the judgment is based. Something is true when judgment concurs with reality. In the case of plausibility, judgment is not made with reference to the things themselves, but with reference to the listeners and their beliefs. Let us look at some of the passages in which Aristotle recommends the use of this dialectical method in the different stages of investigation. Firstly, as highlighted in text number 12, it can be used in a general manner for intellectual debates, for intellectual training, casual encounters, and as a first step towards philosophy. Because, text number 13 and 14, the possession of a plan of inquiring will enable us more easily to argue about the subject proposed. As states in Metaphysics 15, the dialectical method should be used at the beginning of the argumentation, both to state and specify the issue accurately, and also to know if somebody before us has already considered it and had found the solution. In a second phase of the argumentation, he encourages us to use endoxa as 16 indicators that the investigation is proceeding along the right path. 17, to recognize the truth or falsity of an aporia and to know where that truth or falsity lies. Since given that it is of a probable nature, the dialectical reasoning does not force us to focus on the subject from only the true point of view, but rather allows us to focus on the problem from two opposing points of view. Because the ability to seek difficulties on both sides of the subject will make us detect more easily the truth and error regarding the various issues that arise. In another sense, 18, recourse to the opinions of experts allows us to establish first principles, the ultimate basis of principles used in various sciences, that, through being non-demonstrable, remain outside the field of what can be reasoned and that which has been established from the truth. In text 19, he explains the need to resort to the dialectical method in order to be able to correctly address a thesis. To reach the truth, it is necessary to first defend a position and its opposite, and to respond to the objections and of one and the other, whether they are dealing with real speakers or if we have to think about and reply to the questions ourselves. We then have to deduce the consequences of both hypotheses and compare them, 20, so as to be able finally to choose the right one and reject the false one, 21. Once a principle has been established, it must be revised again with regard to the experts' opinions and, faced with different points of view, decide who is right. On the heaven, 22, he uses the metaphor of litigants in a trial, whose arguments should be impartially listened to by a judge, so as to be in a position to give an impartial verdict, because if these opinions are not taken into account, it could be like making accusations without letting the accused defend themselves, 23. And in the final stage of a line of arguments, he uses the endoxa. Also, the use of endoxa is also necessary to reinforce the position that we have reached after having studied the case, as stated in Nicomachean Ethics 24. And finally, to establish, if possible, all, or if not all, then the greater part and most important of the opinions are generally held with respect to the states of mind, since if the discrepancies can be resolved and a residuum of current opinion remain, the true view will have been sufficiently established. Here is not the moment to offer a judgment on the degree of veracity with which Aristotle transmits the thoughts of his predecessors. Our interest here is simply to highlight his role as a doxographer, and above all, his contributions to the history of thought, of the idea that continuity and development of thought exists, and that the opinions of the experts constitute the basis for and the touchstone of a correct argumentation. The concept of Sophia as the engine of the evolution of thought and society. The idea of progress in the development of thought and the science of investigation that we have discussed contrasts with the vision of discontinuity that Aristotle speaks of in other passages, where he supposes, as if it were a stated fact, that civilizations periodically disappear for various reasons and in different ways, and that because of this a rupture in tradition exists, one which prevents us from maintaining what we might call historical memory. And he explained this clearly in a very interesting passage on meteorology, the text number 25. But the whole vital process of the Earth takes place so gradually and in periods of time which are so immense compared with the length of our life that these changes are not observed, and before their cause can be recorded from beginning to end, whole nations perish and are destroyed. Of such destruction, the most utter and sudden are due to wars, but pestilence or famine cause it too. Famines, again, are either sudden and severe or else gradual. In the latter case, the disappearance of a nation is not noticed, because some leave the country while others remain. And this goes on until the land is unable to maintain any inhabitants at all. So a long period of time is likely to elapse from the first departure to the last, and no one remembers this. The lapse of time destroying all records even before the last inhabitants have disappeared. In the same way, a nation must be supposed to lose account of the time when it first settled a land that was changing from a marshy and watery state and becoming dry. Here too, change is gradual and lasts a long time, and men do not remember who came first or when or what the land was like when they came first. The idea that nature is subjected to periodic destructions caused by cataclysms or gradual natural phenomena is already found in Plato, and Aristotle develops it in one of his first dialogues on philosophy, 26. According to this view, it could be impossible to establish historic continuity, given that the total rupture that exists between one civilization and the following one prevents the new generations from knowing or remembering what constitutes their cultural heritage. Thus, everything that represents the identity of the people is lost. Technical knowledge, political configurations, and the collective historical beliefs and myths about their own past, and about the existence of deities and their nature. Yet more important than the theory of the destruction of civilizations is that of the subsequent consequences here, palingenesis, the reproduction of the historical course. It is once again in the dialogue on philosophy where he describes the process that goes from the destruction of a civilization to the formation of a new society, in different stages of development that correspond to different ideas that can be understood as wisdom, Sophia. 27. According to the text, this would initially lead to the invention of resources for a society's survival, such as grading wit, then the arts, then laws, and finally the divine entities. The same idea outlined in far greater detail would be developed later in politics, where he describes with more exact terminology the different stages of development from the state of initial cataclysm to the full formation of the polis, 28. The development of the social community is therefore seen as a natural and necessary process, and hence one which is timeless, atopic, and repeated at different historical moments. The same perception can be seen in relation to beliefs and opinions, and On the Heaven, 29, he states that these have come to be believed and transmitted countless times. More specifically, he says that proverbs are the relics of the ancient philosophy that withheld the great destruction of humanity and that were saved due to their concision and perspicacity, 30 and 31. The last point, the different treatment of each science. We now turn again to the text 7 and 8, mentioned in the first section, to explain why the different nature of each science is what determines the way to use the information initially gathered. In these passages, Aristotle states that historians should limit themselves to narrating past occurrences as particular events, and that it is not their task to draw generalization from them about what might happen according to livelihood or need, nor is their role to seek a causal relationship between what else occurred during the same period of time. Aristotle's valuation here is surprising, to say the least, in that he was the first person to directly study documents in which facts were recorded, and indeed he carried out a significant amount of work compiling, classifying, and describing the material under investigation. For him, this task of collecting data, the historia, has value only as a preliminary process, similar to what might be done in the description of a natural phenomenon, or with information relating to the dissection of an animal. And while in natural sciences a generalizing principle is drawn from data provided through causal inference, a necessary and universal law that is later applied to particular cases, in the human sciences, the incorporation of this individual material must be carried out following a different method, because human actions by their nature are not likely to come into causal relationship with one another, and thus cannot be submitted to need. Rather, they are contingent. The reason is that these sciences operate in the field of practical reasoning, of phronesis, in which necessity does not have a place, because each human act is always a product of free will and is therefore unique. The fact that it isn't possible to establish a necessary principle that determines the events expected in human acts does not mean that human sciences must always be studied as a set of unique and particular information. A certain degree of generalization is necessary, and this indeed is the mission of historical knowledge, as he explains in 32. Historical knowledge, therefore, is knowledge of experience, of generalization on similar cases, that when applied to human sciences allows us to theorize about human behavior and to make an object of science which would otherwise only be susceptible to observation, as a phenomenon undergoing random influences. Historical research would only be a necessary instrument to make descriptions and analysis of specific situations in terms of universal components of factors, in the same way that the natural sciences determine universal taxonomic types that are applied as models to analyze and to render comprehensible the empirical and contingent behavior of organisms. Human history determines universal taxonomic types, both those relating to forms of political organizations such as oligarchies, tyrannies, democracies, within which the life of a city necessarily develops, and types of behavior that determine the principles of ethics. Data arising from historical investigation would also be one of the sources for deliberation, one of the standards for the forming of prudential judgment about what is the best, both in the field of personal reflection and in collective discussions in terms of correctly guiding the decisions of a government. A simple illustration of this is how it is employed in the constructions of syllogisms, as can be seen in 33, and in the use made in rhetorical historical examples in the deliberative discourse as a criterion of verisimilitude, as a source of persuasion that occurs within the scope of that what Aristotle calls tochos epitopoli, what happens most of the time. A type of certainty on which knowledge is based, one that makes reference to what is characteristic of human nature, that by its own essence cannot be necessary, but from which popular scientific general knowledge can be derived. Conclusions. It's difficult to evaluate the extent to which Aristotle's conception of investigation and his use of dialectic argumentation influenced the opinions of other past authors. Many of them did transmit and adapt his views and methods, extending them beyond exclusively philosophical areas, and making a kind of popular episteme of his valuable doxography. His methods came into widespread use, and his not always scientific views were popularized by writers such as didactic poets and later by rhetoricians. His conception of scientific knowledge, as we have discussed, is complex. Moreover, it changes when applied to different sciences. For this reason, his methods were in some way amenable to the aims of popular science. This is particularly the case with ethics and physics, where dialectic argumentation is considered to be wholly sufficient method to ensure knowledge, in that these sciences deal with objects that are not susceptible to more exact demonstration. Having evaluated the whole process of direct and indirect research and argumentation, we can claim that to some extent Aristotle did indeed establish a line of thinking which allowed for scientific knowledge to develop into popular science. Thank you.